Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praises of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm going to be debating again Brenton Lengel. Is that correct? Brenton Lengel. Yes, and instead of debating anarchism, we're going to debate, broadly speaking, the blue tribe versus red tribe, right versus left, with dabbling in both social issues and also political issues. Now, the way I see the left is there's a Latin phrase called non servam, which was, of course, attributed to Lucifer. It says, "I will not obey." And we have within Augustine's theology the idea of the well-ordered concord, tranquillitatis ordinis. And the idea here is that where is order to be found? Is it to be found internally or externally? So we have Augustine in book 19, chapter, I don't read the whole thing, but chapter 13 of the City of God. And he says, the peace of body and soul is the well-ordered and harmonious life and health of the living creature. Peace between man and God is the well-ordered obedience of faith to eternal law. Peace between man and man is well-ordered concord. Domestic peace is the well-ordered concord between those of the family who rule and those who obey. Civil peace is similar concord among the citizens. Now, this attitude is also mirrored in a doppelganger form by the Marquis de Sade in his Philosophy of the Bedroom. For the state of the moral man is one of tranquility and peace. The state of an immoral man is one of perpetual unrest that pushes him to and identifies him with the necessary insurrection in which the republic must always keep the government of which he is a member. Now, for a little bit of a backup here, the classic view of the soul is Plato's tripartite soul, which is the rational, spirited, and appetitive. So reason is that part of the soul that is governed by reason. Spirited aspect is that of thumos, which is often identified with sort of outbursts like of anger or of joy. And then there's the appetitive soul, the appetites. And so the appetites are, both spirit and the appetites are governed by the rational soul. One analogy was the horse and the rider. The horse was the appetitive, the animal appetites and desires. And then through the spirit of the bridle, the rational human could control the horse. So we have a dichotomy between external and internal order. The left views order as coming from external to the individual, whereas traditional societies have viewed order as coming from internal, a state of the soul. We see this in Christianity, we see this in Buddhism, we see this in Stoicism, we see this with Plato and Aristotle, whereas the left argues that not only is the order external, imposed on the individual, but also there's this attempt to cultivate what has classically been called the vices. And again, de Sade is a famous example of that, but he's not alone. We have one of the earliest examples of a sort of proto-leftist attitude is Croesus in the Histories by Herodotus. He argues to King Cyrus that if he wants to pacify the city of Sardis, his own former capital city, that what he should do is get them indulging in the games and in brothels and taking away bread and circus, so that they won't fight back. And then we see this repeated again and again. We have one of the quotes that I think is very interesting by Aldous Huxley is that he says, this is one of the not prequels, but introductions to Brave New World. As political and economic freedom diminishes, sexual freedom tends to compensatingly to increase. And the dictator will do well to encourage that freedom. In conjunction with the freedom to daydream under the influence of dope, movies, and the radio, it will help to reconcile the subject to the servitude which is their fate. And again, we see others. There was the former Lieutenant Ralph Peters, who in 1997 wrote an essay called Constant Conflict, where he argued that American culture of Dallas and Baywatch was a weapon against our Russian and Islamic enemies by corrupting them from the inside out, making them susceptible. By spreading the war of the inner soul to our opponents, we can then better take advantage of them because they're busy fighting themselves. If someone's fighting himself, then he can't fight the other guy. So basically, that's the broad category how I define right and left. The right views order as stability is external to the individual, not an internal condition. And the right argues that there is a sort of ordained by nature or the divinities or by God, Aristotle used nature, the Christians used God, the ancient Greeks like Hergus of Sparta said we should obey my laws because I was given those laws by the gods. And then there's this corresponding set of orders that they fit into. So that's the definition that at least I'm going to be using.
Okay, well, that's a good definition, and I can go along with it, though I do think it leaves a couple of things out, because I think there is more of an overlap between right and left thinking. I think that if you look at, for instance, this has been going around for years, but if you look at the political compass, for instance, and you'll see people, putting and moving from various positions to others. You see a sliding scale of authoritarian versus libertarian ideas, and then you also see a sliding scale of, I suppose, you could put it individualism versus collectivism, or the other way of looking at it is self-interest versus the interest of everyone, including the self, or that the self-interest is the interest of everyone, or vice versa. What I'd say first off is that whatever we want to call right v left, we can use your definitions of it if we want to. I think that my view, sort of how conservatism and progressiveness, I guess, functions in society is very similar to the way that different competing drives function in the human mind. Be they the drive for food, which is checked then by the desire to the desire to be careful and not eat too much. A good example, like, for instance, horses don't have that drive. And as a result, what will happen if you have horses in a field is, if there's just like one source of grain, the horses will clump together, and the strongest horse will beat away all the others, and it'll sit there and it will eat that one source of grain until it dies. Uh, and then the next horse will come in and beat away all the others and eat that one source of grain again until it dies, and the next and the next. Humans, and we would say that is actually inhuman. Humans have the ability to kind of look a bit beyond that, and beyond their baser instincts, and to check various drives. But the way I see the human brain knitted together is less of a single entity, and more, this drive wants this drive wants that, and through the interaction and the opposition of various forces, we come eventually to action and to policy. And so I would say, as far as if we're going to talk about right v left, we're really talking about two things that I think are both necessary for society. It'll be funny, but I'm actually going to quote the Bible here in First Corinthians, and it's the verse about the body of Christ, where it says, "The body is a unit, and though it is composed of many parts, and although its parts are many, they all form one body. So it is with Christ. For in one spirit we are all baptized into the body, whether Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and we were all given the one spirit to drink. For the body does not consist of one part, but of many. If the foot should say, 'Because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body,' that would not make it any less part of the body. And if the ear should say, 'Because I am not an ear, I do not belong to the body,' that would not make it any less part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But in fact, God has arranged the members of the body, every one of them, according to his design. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body. The eye cannot say unto the hand, 'I have no need of thee,' nor can the head say to the feet, 'I have no need of thee.' On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be the weaker are indispensable, and the parts we consider less honorable we treat with greater honor, and our unpresentable parts are to be treated with special modesty, whereas our presentable parts have no such need. But God has composed the body and has given greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its members should have mutual concern for one another. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now,
Real quick, your idea of the soul just sounds kind of like the Platonic soul, where the rational element that the animal lacks causes it to act in excess according to appetite, which kills it. But humans having reason can choose to use their reason to control the appetite, which of course the animal can't.
yes, correct.
I think maybe to maybe to hone in. I mean, I agree that there's this corporate element. You know, traditionalists aren't individualists. Maybe the gray tribe is, but
Yeah.
you know, we're not. But I think the key issue here is autonomy versus submission. So whether you read Confucius' Analects or Aristotle's Politics or Augustine's The City of God, or you know, any other work of political or philosophical ideology like that, and then you read, say, anarchists or Marxists or liberals, and by liberal I would even include John Locke, but
Mhm.
you know,
Oh,
and that's certain, even to some extent, anarcho capitalists. But the idea is that is it individual autonomy, or is it? So let's, for instance, within the context of Confucius, he gives us 4 relationships that cohere throughout all time and all places. There could be a 5th one, and I'll add that later. That of the ruler over the subject. These are hierarchical relationships. That of the husband over the wife, of the parents over the children, of the older brother over the younger brother, and then one could also argue over the religious authorities over the laity. Now,
yes. I mean,
those
Confucius was essentially a very ancient version of Ann Landers.
yeah, but what the point is, though, they apply everywhere and always. I use the analogy of mathematics. Whether you live in Mesopotamia or Mesoamerica, the people who built pyramids and ziggurats are using the same math, and they discovered it independently of one another, which gives us the indication that mathematics is inherently baked into the system, and that no matter where you come from, you're going to come roughly to the same conclusions, the same broad contours. Now, mathematics is a good deal more precise than social science, but social science, which of course is a modern term, they would have probably called it political economy back in the day. But political economy is akin to mathematics in the sense that its aim is to derive the unchanging structures of human organization that cohere across time and space. And I think those 5 points, the 5th one that I added to Confucius's 5, now, how those are organized is highly contentious and debated even within these groups, but that's what they agree on. The left fundamentally rejects that in favor of maximal personal autonomy, because in those systems, you have to subordinate yourself to somebody else, and that of course impinges against your autonomy. A classic example is the anarchist slogan "No gods, no masters,"
Yes.
especially in the
Which was a socialist slogan before it was an anarchist slogan,
well,
actually.
why don't you explain socialism too? Because that's a big part of what the left is.
Well, it depends on what you're talking about when you're talking about socialism. If
How
you have,
about socialists as they describe themselves?
yeah, you're going to get a bunch of different answers.
No, I know.
Here's what I would say about socialism. Socialism has come in the United States to mean a version of welfare capitalism on one hand, or Stalinism on the other. And it really changes depending upon what's more convenient for the argument that's being put forth. Like people will say, oh, you know, Bernie Sanders is a socialist. And I'll tell you, having spent years and years on the left, Bernie Sanders is no such thing. He's basically an FDR Democrat. But he was smart enough to realize that after years of Obama being called a socialist, if he denied his socialism, he would just be called a liar. And so he found instead he played into it and got a great deal of fame and success as a result. But that doesn't necessarily make him a socialist. Now, what I would
But
say is
okay,
there's
sorry.
there's a lot of historical attempts at socialism. The overall goal of it is not necessarily to maximize human freedom. There are socialists who are on that end of the spectrum, and that's where it comes down to the political compass. And the socialists who are on that and on the freedom end are the ones like me, the ones who are the anarchists, the left libertarians. But in fact, there is a very strong authoritarian wing of the socialism, which are the Marxists, and they tend to be extremely controlling of society and the individual and the environment. Now, you mentioned that leftists in their philosophy generally look to external factors as opposed to internal ones to explain human behavior, and that is true. Marxists in particular are they because Marxists are determinists, and they are sort of obsessed with the idea that the external conditions around humanity um, determine human behavior. And sort of their game is to get the perfect external conditions in order to create the perfect people. Um,
Which is
anarchist.
funny. That's the same as fascism, because Nazism wanted to control the physical conditions to create the perfect people too.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's also that's an early idea that a lot of people had in that time. I mean, if you go back, there's a great essay that Leon Trotsky wrote that was supposed to be a speech.
Oh yeah, yeah. Every man's going to be an Aristotle and a Marx. Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
is that
no,
the
no,
one?
no, no. It's called. You can Google it. It's called "If America Should Go Communist." And
Okay.
what's great about that actually is Leon Trotsky's point in it was essentially like, if Americans did communism, we'd do it better than anybody else. And
Well,
to a certain extent, I think he might have a bit of a point there, because I do think a lot of the excesses of the Bolsheviks, especially in the realm of creepy authoritarian stuff, really came down more to Russian culture necessarily than leftist ideology. There's definitely some creepy stuff in Marx, and especially Marx-Leninism, but I feel like if you took a culture like the United States and you had us pursue a Marxist or anarchist vision, we might be much, much better at it, because we have these natural drives within our culture that counteract some of the more creeping authoritarian ideas. But to come right
well,
down to it, what I want to define socialism as is two things. One is the general historical movement to create a utopic society where all members from the highest to the lowest are cared for and nobody dies on the street of exposure or starvation. That's the goal. And that can get really silly sometimes. I think one of the very first socialists ever, this was well before Marx or the anarchists, had he become a bit of a footnote in history because he believed that in the socialist utopia, the seas would turn to lemonade, which is obviously ridiculous for so many reasons. But if you wanted to tell me, like, besides that general thing, what does that mean in real life material terminology? Socialism is the idea that the workers should control their own workplace, and that the profit of that workplace should be controlled not by a board of directors or investors, but should be primarily controlled by the people who are doing the work itself. So really what socialism is to me is worker ownership. Now you
okay.
could, yeah,
There's a
you could
couple
have an
points.
well, real quick, sorry.
Sure.
You could have an authoritarian version of worker ownership where they say the state comes in, takes the place of the capitalist class, and enforces the worker ownership via the use of its military and police force, which I'm obviously against. But then on the other hand, the anarchist approach to it is the workers themselves taking what is honestly already in their position and cutting the capitalist class out of the equation, thus taking their futures in their hands. And when we remove that kind of abuse and that kind of where we have to hand over x amount of money to a guy who's already a millionaire and instead can use it to help the families and help the communities around them, then I think you can have something close to a utopia, even though utopias are impossible.
Okay, yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought up the utopic aspect of it. I'll get to that in a moment. But you were talking about the autonomy issue. The autonomy issue. Now, I will agree that. But when I say the definition that I gave of the left, I would include libertarians, Marxists, fascists, Nazis, anarchists, and the whole rest of them for this reason. Because the original modernist thinkers, you can think people like Voltaire and Diderot and de Holbach and Humboldt and others argued that, again, in that Luciferian sense, that they are not going to submit to any authority, divine authority, the authority of the church, the authority of the state. And so what happens was when you destroy that authority, I think Voltaire said, we'll only have freedom when the last king is strangled in the entrails of the last priest.
That's Diderot, but yes.
Diderot. Yeah, Diderot. But what happened is when you destroy those structures of authority that admittedly can be misused, you had a vacuum, and that vacuum you have two ways to respond to that power vacuum. You can either say, okay, wow, we really need authority, and they go overboard with totalitarianism like fascism and communism, or you could go and you could just embrace the vacuum like anarchism and libertarianism and just say the more vacuum the better. And what I'm not saying is they don't, the outworkings of that autonomy base can paradoxically lead to totalitarianism. But what I'm getting at is that both the libertarian wing, and I mean both in right-left libertarians in that sense, and then the autocratic wing, either the communists or the fascists, they both arise from the same point. And the other point is that point of autonomy versus submission. And the other point is with the, especially the libertarian anarchists, and to large degrees today even anarcho-capitalists and libertarians, is that the traditional gender roles, traditional roles of authority and hierarchy, doesn't have to be the state. It could be the tribal chieftain. Doesn't really matter. It's the same from a desert Bedouin tribe, or it's the Imperial Chinese Empire. But those fundamental five relationships that more or less Confucius outlines are fundamentally rejected by all of these modern groups. Now, as for the utopic society, this again would be tied into the autonomy. Man saves himself, right? Every religion has this Eden myth, right? The Greeks have an Eden myth, the Chinese have an Eden myth, the Christianity has an Eden myth, and so they all believe that perfection existed at one point in the past, and perfection, if it's to be achieved again, is only going to be achieved via some sort of divine intercession. Now, the form of the divine intercession is radically different from religion to religion. But that's another aspect of what makes the red tribe different, the blue tribe different than the red tribe. That man saves himself not only without God, but in opposition to God, or the gods, or however you want to construe the divine authority.
Yeah, though to be fair, a lot of that stems from anti-clericalism, and a lot of the anti-clericalism stems from the numerous religious wars that engulfed Europe over the centuries, because the authority of the church began to become incredibly resented as we moved into the Enlightened Age. I mean the Enlightenment. I'm not saying they're
I know
enlightened, but
I would say this though, that even today though those beliefs are very strong, and they were just as strong in Protestant countries like in the United States. The individualist anarchists were just as anti-clerical as the Spanish anarchists, but in North America we had no established church and nothing rivaling the abuses of the Catholic Church in Spain, yet they still had the same militant anti-clericalism.
Yeah, which what I would actually say is that's karma. Even though we didn't have those specific institutions, when you do something that big in the past, when an organization has that much control, where you've got the Spanish Inquisition and the Huguenots, you will feel the ripples of those actions and those political struggles down through the ages for centuries. I mean, a great example, honestly, is the Civil War here in America. We are still feeling the fallout of that. And I was never involved in it. You were never involved in it. No one living today had anything whatsoever to do with it. And yet, at the same time, a number of things that just go on in my life, politically, economically, whatever, are affected by the Civil War. My education is affected by it. The authors that I read, there's a ton of ANCAPs that think they're anarchists because they read Lysander Spooner's criticism of Lincoln, but they didn't read the part where Lysander Spooner wanted to go down and organize free a bunch of slaves, organize them into a militia, and turn the whips of the slave owners on them. And so, they're sitting there seeing Lysander Spooner as this champion of their kind of neo-Confederate ideals, and not all of them, but some of them. Rothbard talked about how he wanted to see the statues of Lincoln torn down and replaced with Jefferson Davis, which is just ridiculous because, first off, Rothbard was like a New York Jew. Like he had no connection to the South at all, but he knew what he was going to play off of. But you see how that affects it. And what that is in the Buddhist sense is karma. It is the law of, action and reaction. So I think that these particular tendencies and ideologies are not necessarily a creation of the individual philosophies themselves, as the philosophy is built by the actions of the past. And that kind of goes to a lot of what progressivism seeks to deal with, which is to free ourselves from the past. In a lot of ways, what they're trying to do, what leftists are trying to do, is, in a very real sense, change our karma. Now, we can argue this is good, this is bad, we should do this, we shouldn't do this, but I think that is what the drive primarily is, because you talk about all of these pillars from various societies, but I feel like that's a big jump to make, because humans have been on this planet for something like 150 to 200,000 years. We've only had recorded history for 5,000, and there's a lot of things that were thought of as pillars in the past that simply are not. They were functions of human culture, as opposed to human nature. And so as a result of all of this, I think that we have to remember that man is mortal, and that not only is man mortal, but man is not perfect. And if man isn't perfect, that means everything that we've done in the past up till now is necessarily wrong in some way. No matter how good it is, no matter how perfect it is, we didn't get something right. And so there always has to be room to change and grow and let go of aspects of the past. Because, as many Buddhists would say, to cling to tradition is a form of, it's Maya. Or I'm sorry, Maya's illusion. It's Mara. It's like the devil king of the sixth heaven. Like when you cling to something to an unhealthy degree, this can cause you a lot of distress and can cause a lot of social distress. So I think the force of progressivism in general is one that does seek to free us from, I guess, the actions of those who came before us that we don't actually have anything to do with, but are still somewhat in the thrall of.
Well, I mean, I certainly wouldn't disregard, obviously, the misabuses of these pillars as giving, quote unquote, justification in the minds of some for tearing them down. But on the one hand, that's kind of a ridiculous assumption. Let's say you grew up with a broken family, hypothetically, and you then conclude from that family is a corrupt institution, it should be completely abolished.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've tried that. It doesn't work. There's two ways you can completely abolish the family. You can have common ownership of women, which is what Plato recommended. And we also see broken families where the government has stepped in with welfarism. And in either case has society functioned as well as it did when we were on the golden mean, as Aristotle would say.
Yeah. Can we maybe try just not owning people and letting people be themselves? I mean, the idea that we have to choose between the government owning women and common ownership of women. I kind of feel more or less like we shouldn't be talking about owning women.
Well, no, well, but I don't mean government ownership. I mean the traditionalist ideal. Well, the Christian ideal is that God owns all of us, and that Paul tells us that the husband and the wife have a partial quota share of one another.
Yeah, I've always hated the idea of. I get into this actually with ANCAPs a lot when we talk. They talk about self ownership, and I've always hated that idea. If it be it God owns us, or we own ourselves, or we own other people, because it's very much a slap in the face to humanity to think about a person, like a human being, a completely unique universe that will see everything and experience everything around them in a completely unique way, and can affect events in so many different ways, good or bad. To look at that and to think of that in the same way you'd think of as a toaster, or a cow or a field. um, and so that's definitely something that I tend to, and maybe also this is a problem with language and with translation. um, but I don't like the idea of owning anyone or being owned, and especially I don't like the idea of a person owning themselves, because when you own yourself, that leads you to believe that you're a thing, and you should be used, eh, as a thing is used. I think Heidegger talked about this. It's the process is called enframing, where comes from the Greek term techne, technology. That the essence of technology is not anything technological, but it is in the way of thinking, of looking at the earth and seeing what is concealed within, seeing like a beautiful vase and a lump of clay. And what happens is when you apply that too much, when you begin to enframe all of society around you, be it women, be it resources, be it yourself, what happens is um, you begin to disregard the importance of it, and see it only as an aspect to be acted on by your will. And when that happens, that's when slavery happens. That's when murders happen. When the human desire to control and dominate takes over, because oftentimes I find that the desire to control and dominate, be it through force or through wealth, that comes primarily from fear. It's ultimately the desire to protect oneself, first from the outside environment, and then eventually from death, which of course none of us can do. Um, so, what I'd say, I guess, I hope I haven't gone off on too much of a tangent here. Um, but I think we have to be very, very careful in how we think of other people and how we talk about them, because the words that we use inform our thoughts. And I mean, maybe that's actually kind of coming down to the leftist idea that the environment uh, does impact how you behave, and what you do impacts how you behave. Like the Kurt Vonnegut novel, Night Mother or Mother Night, where the guy pretends to be a Nazi for so long that
Mhm.
like he's basically a Nazi.
Yeah. So basically, it seems like what you're saying here is that when you speak of terms of owning somebody, you've objectified them, and in objectifying them, to the extent that you have objectified them, you then treated them as an instrument rather than an end in itself in a kind of Kantian sense. And
Exactly.
by reducing them to an instrument, you then open them up the possibility of abuse.
Hmm.
Um, Now, let me ask you this: hypothetically, let's say that you created an artificial intelligent machine. Now, you made it; it was you're the produce of your labor, but it was also self-aware and sentient. Now, would you own that machine?
That's a huge question that I think we're probably going to have to answer, because we will wind up creating that level of artificial intelligence. The closest thing that I can put that to is I created a child. Um,
Hmm.
and I'm hoping to have a child sometime in the
Hmm.
next 6 months or so. Well,
Well, good.
start on a child sometime in the next 6 months. Yeah, I'm very excited. Um, but I remember actually one of the first things that I thought to myself was, I can't wait for my son or daughter to defy me. Um, like, I'm kind of very excited about that. I know it's gonna make me angry when it happens, but um, I would say that if you created an artificial intelligence or a organic intelligence, that organic intelligence is its own thing, and you are not entitled to control it. Now, you can control it for its own best interests for a certain amount of time. And legally, obviously, with the way laws are now, you would own that robot until the law is changed. But I would say morally, the idea that we own our children, or the idea that we own these robots, is no, no, we're stewards. We're stewards until they can take control of their own lives.
Okay, well, the point that I bring this up is this, okay, because in Romans 9:21, Paul says, "Does not the potter have power over the clay, from some lump to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? What if God, wanting to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with long suffering the vessels wrath prepared for destruction, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? Even us whom he has called, not only of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles." So the point is this. Now, you mentioned the child analogy, but here's why I don't think it works for the robot or for us vis-a-vis God. You and the child are of the same order of being. You're the same kind of thing. God is fundamentally different than us. As you know, the Old Testament prophet said, he is as high above us as the heavens are above the earth.
Yeah,
And
he's holy.
a human being and a robot, well, depends on how you want to interpret the technology fusionist type people. Is it they're gonna have robots that are like demigods, like the Terminator, or are they going to be subordinate to us, like an iRobot, who, whatever? But the fact that I have the power to create you independently of any fact, independent of myself, is an authority granting permission. So, for instance, if I create a pot, and I have a pot that I use for, a vase that I use for decoration, and another vase is, back in their day, a chamber pot. So, I mean, one is for parties, one is for taking a dump. But the point is, though, you have the right to decide how those objects are used, because either A, you made them, or B, you bought them from someone who gave you the right to use them, because there's a fundamental distinction between the two. Now, you also mentioned that with a child, um, we eventually grows up enough that the parental authority is no longer really required. And that's true. But child does eventually grow up to the point that he doesn't actually need a parental guidance, at least shouldn't have to need parental guidance. People that don't learn go to jail, and they're called criminals. But
Yeah.
the point is this, though,
way.
God, we never actually grow up. Vis-a-vis God, we never grow up, because God is infinite and eternal. So I think it would break down there.
Yeah, well, assuming that God is actually like that, and that's, and I would take issue with a number of those suppositions, but um, here's what I'd say. Let's practice a little bit of empathy and kind of take ourselves out of it, because I've noticed a bias that humans tend to have, is that we tend to think that we live in the best time possible every single time that we're alive. And I don't, it's so weird when you actually, I was just looking back at some of the stuff that had happened, because our world seems to be completely going off the rails. Paradoxically, we live in it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But I went back and I looked at I looked at like 1907 and what art was coming out then, what people were doing, what battles were being fought, and how many people were being killed. Um, and I look back, at various other times in history, and I kind of realized that these, I don't think we actually do live at the best time. I mean, it's the best time because we're here now.
Oh, I actually totally agree. I think we're living in one of the worst times. But what are the things that I
Say
wanted
we're living in both.
to? Well, I mean, it depends on in which context. Longevity and quality of life, best, no doubt. But a whole lot of other reasons, not so much.
Yeah.
But
Well, actually, longevity, not so much. That's a common misconception. Humans lived about around, like, in the last, I don't know, half a decade, or I'm sorry, last half a century. Yeah, we've jumped a little bit. Um, but the reason the human life expectancy was so low earlier in prehistory was not that 35 was the same thing as being 80. it was because of the high levels of infant mortality, which
Yeah.
is great.
And
I'm very
disease.
glad.
And
Yeah,
disease.
yeah, infant mortality and disease. But at the same time, humans still could live about as long as we would. Like, you could reach back and find a human from, like, grab a human baby from 200,000 years ago and pull that baby up here and raise him with us. They'd be more or less the same.
Oh, there was a pharaoh that I remember read lived to be 96. He had
Hmm.
good diet and good health care, the best he could get at the time. And yeah, but the point that you brought up about the objectifying humanity, and that's what, from what I understand, what you're saying is to the extent that we objectify humans, in the sense we do that by treating them as to some extent property,
Hmm.
that then we're not treating them as ends in themselves, but means to an end, which then gives rise to wars and oppressions and things like that.
Wars, oppression, abuse, rape, basically
Exactly.
any crime, um, any great crime and any great tragedy can be traced to one thing, and that thing is, oddly enough, a what's called a slander of the Lotus Sutra, which, the law of the Lotus Sutra is Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. And it's specifically a law that's very difficult to understand, and very difficult to talk about. Um, but what it essentially means is that all humans, we are essentially the same thing, and we are worth the same, even though we're different. We're many in body, we're one in mind, and as a result, the slander of the Lotus Sutra, you could say that that's saying things against the specific text itself, or saying that that's not true. But really, that's not what's important. What's important is it's the slander of the essence of the Lotus Sutra, what the Lotus Sutra tries to get across, which is the mystic law. And essentially, the mystic law is that we are all, equally worthy of, respect and, the chance to grow and thrive, within this, environment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And what we call fundamental darkness is humans' tendency to forget this. Um,
Yeah.
to
Okay.
get
So, but what I want to get at is where, from the tradition of Western Christendom,
Mhm.
and I don't know about the Greeks, not so much, I don't think. But where do wars come from? Well, James, I think, says it best. James 4, where do wars come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight in war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, so that you may spend it on your pleasures. So you see, actually,
Mhm.
I think the Greeks probably would agree with this, because Aristotle and Plato would argue that it's the distemper of the soul that where all this comes from. And
Mhm.
it's not just a Christian concept. Marquis de Sade and uh, Bertrand Russell, not Bertrand Russell, the Brave New World guy, I can't think of his name right now, Aldous Huxley,
Yeah.
all agree that it's a distemper in the soul where reason fails to overcome appetite. Now,
Mhm.
what the other thing is,
Hang on, if I can interrupt you right there, because, okay, so essentially, I mentioned him earlier, but this is the, essentially the Buddhist devil, as far as Nichiren devils goes, is the devil king of the sixth heaven, who is not necessarily a literal being, but more a, personification of the human tendency of fundamental darkness. But listen to this: devil king of the sixth heaven, who is also referred to as the devil king or heavenly devil, the king of the devils who dwells in the highest of the sixth heaven of the world of desire. He is also named freely enjoying things conjured by others, the king who makes free use of the fruits of others' efforts for his own pleasure. Served by innumerable minions, he obstructs Buddhist practice and delights in sapping the life force of other beings. One of the four devils, and it goes into that. So, in the same way, the devil king of the sixth heaven is exactly what, those Greeks were talking about when they said, "Why do wars happen?" It happens because we want to set one human above others. We want to gain things that we have not worked for. We want to be served by others, but not give of ourselves in the same way. And this is, ultimately it's a delusion. It's a mistake that we make because one, we think we can have that and it'll be okay. And no, it can't. I can't imagine, I can't think of a human being who more fits, like who seems to be more under the sway of the devil king of the sixth heaven than say Donald Trump, because he's so controlled by his desires. Uh, but I can't imagine that Donald Trump is a happy person. I can't imagine that the world that he inhabits, the universe of his brain, is one that I would ever want to be even close to, just because of what kind of reality that might generate. Subjective reality, obviously. And I would say that, once again, it comes down to denying the humanity and the worthiness of those who are not like us, or that we can assume aren't like us, be they foreigners, be they people from a lower social class or a higher social class. And I think that's
Yeah.
the big mistake people make.
Well, okay, would not concede the point that viewing people as instruments within the context of real revelation, whatever that happens to be, and received tradition does that necessarily. It may be a condition in which it can occur, but I would argue that it doesn't necessarily lead to that. But I kind of want to steer this back a little bit to...
Yeah, we are getting a bit esoteric here.
No, what we're doing here is we're talking about what divides right from left, and this is part of the framing of the debate. We're partly framing it right now, but one of the things that I want to get at is both the left and the right. I'll use the Greek term eudaimonia, which means human flourishing and human completion. It basically, the idea is, at least in the Greek context, which is carried over into medieval Christendom, the idea that there's this idea called teleology, which, as everything has a natural end. So Aristotle says that the acorn, his end is in the tree, and it will develop in the tree because that's its end. And so he says that man has certain natural ends, and to the extent that those natural ends are met and conditions are put in place in which he can meet them, then human flourishing can be attained. Now, the left also claims to want human flourishing. Now, the way they would say we attain human flourishing is by, again, the blue tribe definition that I already gave, is by maximizing autonomy to the extent that we do not directly impinge harmfully on someone else's autonomy. So if by exercising my freedom of the will, my free autonomy, as long as I don't therefore impinge on somebody else in a harmful way, like via rape or murder or robbery, then that is the best calculated for human flourishing.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent that's correct. Though that's also a heavy libertarian sentiment, and I think that you lumped in the libertarians with the left, which most libertarians would disagree with. I would somewhat disagree.
I know you both would disagree, but I think you're both a part of the left, and the reason is you're both a part of the left is libertarians, Marxists, fascists, communists, they're all nominalists. Now, are you familiar with the problem of universals?
Well, hang on for just a second, because I would say that communists, like as in the Marxist sense, I don't think they do want that ideal. Marxists very much have the idea that humans need to be controlled, and that bad behavior there shouldn't be an option for bad behavior. And they...
I could see that. I think what I'm getting, okay, let me put it this way. I'm advocating the Aristotelian golden mean between complete individual autonomy and complete state control, where there's some delicate balance in the middle between external control and internal control that has to be achieved. Whereas I think the left, if it tends to go to either extreme. It either goes for complete state control or complete autonomy, or rather, not state control, complete external control. Something external to you controls you. And then there's complete internal control, where nothing outside of you controls you. I mean, at least no rational agent. Of course, nature does, as Bakunin talks about in What is Authority, but no rational will outside of you controls you. And those are the two extremes. But I would argue that, I mean, one of the best examples of this kind of thinking is this really ludicrous statement by Trotsky.
Mhm.
And he said, the average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx. And above this ridge, new peaks will rise. Now, he means communism. By that, he means the stateless utopian society, which
Yeah.
the anarchists want too. They just didn't figure out how to get there.
Yes. Correct.
But here's the thing. The people he mentioned, Goethe, and I don't think, I wouldn't consider Marx a great thinker, but I know he's a Marxist, so he's going to do that. But someone like Goethe, a Shakespeare, a Aristotle, a Dante, those kinds of people do not arise in blue tribe societies. At least they only arise to the extent that the blue tribe societies have not completely exterminated the previous traditionalist society that was there. So, for instance, we could look at the great Soviet composers like Rachmaninoff. But yeah, they were all born during the Tsarist era. They all grew up under the Tsars. When you had children that grew up from the 50s onward, there was no Soviet music on par with the music of the Tsars.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm saying
hang
is,
on for just a second. My wife came home.
Sure.
Hun, I'm doing a thing. Okay, sorry.
So what I'm saying is that the historical record demonstrates that the kind of human flourishing that we both profess to want to attain can only be attained in conditions where the blue tribe, those values of the blue tribe that we more or less agree on, have not become the predominant values.
I think that is patently ridiculous. First off, the Soviet Union did produce a number of very impressive artists that came over with, Baryshnikov is a perfect example. That guy came over and became a superstar here. And there are definitely excesses of the blue tribe that can hinder art, but the red tribe does that just as easily. And
No, it does, but let's look. Okay, that might have been an oversimplification, but let me put it this way: the societies in which we get Shakespeare's and Tolstoy's are not those societies predominantly governed by the blue tribe ideologies.
Well, that's because the blue tribe ideology is constantly moving. When it's like when people wear those shirts that have like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. It says like radical conservatives. No, they weren't radical conservatives.
Yeah, they were radical. They were Jacobins.
Yeah, they were like blue tribe all the way for that day. But as we move on, things change. And suddenly now they would be considered ridiculously radical conservatives because as humans move forward and as our society develops, we begin to see a lot of the errors of the past.
Yeah. But what I'm getting at is anarchists talk about the humans best flourish in their kinds of societies. Now, they have been tried. There's been New Harmony with Owen. Now, that didn't fail due to external pressure. That fell due to internal pressure. It wasn't invaded or conquered.
What is New Harmony? I'm not familiar with this.
That was the utopian socialist experiment in the 1820s.
Was this in the United States?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there was also the Oneida community. There was actually a lot of utopian socialist experiments in the United States.
Yeah.
But the
there
fact
were
is,
also a lot of utopian religious experiments in the United States.
and they actually worked.
Well,
New Harmony was actually run by a bunch of Lutheran pietists, but then they had a vision. Then the guy said he had a vision to sell what he had and go somewhere else.
Well, good, convenient vision to have. But yeah, I mean, and the thing is a lot of them did succeed and a lot of them didn't. And some of the ones that succeeded maybe should not have succeeded. I don't want to go too hard after the Mormons because I don't think there's anything wrong with being a Mormon today. But
back in the day, yeah.
Yeah, there's some really sketchy stuff going on with.
Oh yeah, no, that's not to absolve the religious utopian. That's more, I think, an indictment of the dangers of utopian societies. But
yeah,
I would argue though that there has been the kind of promises, the Trotskyian promise has never been actualized in any blue tribe society.
Well, is there really even a thing as a blue tribe society?
Well, that is the question because the flux and stability. They tend to reject stability in favor of flux, which prevents even the preconditions for such a person to arise.
Yeah, but I'm also going to point out I don't think there's such a thing as a red tribe society either. I think that we mistakenly judge past societies as red tribe societies because of the political institutions that are built. And because no matter how progressive an institution, be it political, personal, whatever,
Mhm.
it will eventually become a part of the red tribe as the march of time goes on.
Have you heard of Julius Evola?
No, not familiar.
He's a far right thinker. The alt right is sort of resuscitated, but he wrote, "My principles are only those that before the French Revolution every well-born person considered sane and normal."
Yeah, that
And
which
I
is ridiculous. But I'm
Well,
sorry.
no, well, it is and it isn't. I mean, the idea of the abolition of the family is insane and ridiculous, and everybody thought it was normal to maintain it until but here's the thing. One of a common line of argument that the left makes against libertarianism, by what I mean by libertarianism is the free market North American version,
Yeah.
is that I've heard it said again and again that there's a two-pronged attack. The one-pronged attack is that there has never been the free market as you define it. That's
Yeah.
right. They'll define free market in this very voluntaristic way, but then you'll come back and say, well, that's never actually existed ever. That's the first prong of the attack. And
Yeah,
the
I
second,
would actually go on to say on the first prong, not only has it never actually existed ever, it is physically impossible for it to ever exist. No matter what you do, even if 100% of the population tomorrow woke up and every single one of them was a dedicated ANCAP, you could not have a free market. It would not happen.
now,
The
okay,
violation of the laws of nature.
so you're making it even stronger. Okay, but
Yeah.
the other prong of the argument is that capitalism itself, even in the more sort of purely Platonic abstraction they conceive of it, has within itself the very preconditions for the rise of the state. And they'll say that, okay, look, guys, but here's the problem. The anarcho-communists have no actual real world examples to point to of something that actually persists in the long run that works. For instance, the idea of property arrangements where you have personal property, which is your own personal effects, and then there's commonly owned property as opposed to private property, only really exists in religious communities. The Hutterites in North America and the monastic orders throughout the world.
Europe, which again, the monastic orders, we talked about this before and I went and checked it out. The Epicureans, I was right actually in our last thing. The Epicureans did live that monastic lifestyle. And most of, if you can look it up in history, most of the Christian monasteries were redubbed Epicurean communities.
You know what? I think I remember that.
Yeah, so I mean, it has existed without a religious component necessarily, though I do think the Epicureans probably were religious. That just wasn't their primary focus.
They weren't atheists. The atheists had never made it work. As a Buddhist, there are Buddhist monasteries that operate on the same conditions, and it does work in that sense. But what I'm saying is, the anarchism as envisioned by Goldman, Kropotkin, Proudhon has never and can never exist.
It has existed. It has not yet taken over the world, but it has existed. We saw it in the Ukraine. We saw it in Catalonia. We see it with the Zapatistas right now. We see aspects of it in. Have you ever seen a documentary called The Take?
No.
I highly recommend if you get a chance to watch it, watch it. It is it's actually one of the things that convinced me to be an anarchist, and it's about the recovered factories movement in Argentina, where what happened was in the 90s they got a president, he sold off everything, including like roads to like MasterCard, and throughout basically followed every single bit of free market friendly advice in the World Bank's playbook. As a result, the country was bankrupted. All of their money was driven out of the country in the dead of the night, and these bosses who owned these various factories and had taken millions and millions in subsidies said, you know what, these factories are no longer profitable. We're going to sell them off. And we're just going to move overseas somewhere else with our millions.
Yeah, but real quick, the point I think what we're getting at here is partly semantic, because in the sense that you said they never the anarcho-capitalist societies never had any historical analogs. So they're going to say, of course, there was Iceland, Ireland, the Middle Ages. There
Yeah,
was.
but that's not possible because both those were pre-capitalist societies. I mean, Iceland, I love Iceland, and they're an example of a society that had a government but not a state.
Hmm.
With the thing, and
Hmm.
the Ireland society, that's ridiculous because you couldn't vote in the what is it called, the Tuatha, if you were allowed to vote based upon your blood and what family you were from. That wasn't everybody, and both societies were slaving societies. So to argue that
Yeah.
either one of
Well,
those
but
was a
exactly.
better
But here's the
society
thing.
is ridiculous. Mhm.
But by the same argumentation, one could argue that Ukraine and the original Zapatistas, not the ones today, and then also the CNT were not truly anarchist either because they were predatory and murdered clerics, the petite bourgeoisie. I
Yeah,
mean,
there were, well, I don't know if the clerics are petite bourgeoisie, but
no, no, no. I mean, I said no. I said and. I don't mean it with the same. I
oh,
mean,
and the petite bourgeoisie. Well, no, the petite bourgeoisie actually sided with the Republic largely. That was one of the characteristics of the Spanish Civil War that made it different, because the petite bourgeoisie sided with the fascists in every other country. But what Franco was fighting for was almost not fascism. It was almost a resurgence of feudalism, where he was really fighting for like a king and nobles. And that's one of the arguments, that Franco wasn't a fascist, which I don't think is accurate. I think he was, but his version was a bit different than others. But that actually forced the petite bourgeoisie into an alliance with the communists, the anarchists, and the
have you read for Farewell? No. What was that? What was that novel written about the Spanish Civil War?
are
For
you
whom the
talking about?
bell tolls? I think
Oh,
was that.
yes, yeah, I've read that.
Yeah.
Hemingway.
Well, yeah, Hemingway, exactly. The Well, they did murder the petite bourgeoisie. There's that whole scene where they throw him off a cliff, and that was based off a real life event in Rwanda.
Mhm. Well, that's not the petite bourgeoisie. That's the bourgeoisie. Those were the owners of the town. Petite bourgeoisie as a social class, and I think it's a social class that doesn't, like. If you want to ask my class background, I'm basically petite bourgeoisie. My father's a doctor. I am an artist, or an artisan. My employer at my old job, at one of the backpacking suppliers that I have, he was petite bourgeoisie. He had his business and he worked for it, and he worked and still does work directly at it. The difference between the petite bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie is the bourgeoisie are essentially the new nobility. They are the people who can make their money off of usury and don't actually have to work, in one way or another. The nobles didn't have to work because of their station and
Estates.
relationship with the
Their
king.
estates.
Yeah, their estates. The bourgeoisie didn't have to work because their enterprises had their personal empires had grown to such an extent that they could live off of the labor of others for the rest of their life and for 10 lifetimes if they wanted to.
Well, yeah. But I think to get back to the other prong that they use, one of the fundamental, I think you would agree, correct me if I'm wrong, but egalitarianism is a pretty central principle to the classic left.
Yes, though I will say egalitarianism is almost categorically misunderstood by the right.
Well, what do you mean by egalitarianism?
Um, okay, so have you ever read that Kurt Vonnegut story, Harrison Bergeron?
Is that the one with the handicapper general?
Yeah, yeah, the handicapper general.
No, but I did see that little movie based off of it.
Okay, so Harrison Bergeron is essentially Kurt Vonnegut's. He's taking the misunderstanding of the right about what egalitarianism is, um, and he is applying it to an actual society where the story gets misunderstood a lot because conservatives will read it. And I remember I made this mistake when I first read it and go, that's it. That's exactly what the left wants. We need to make everybody equal, which means we need to beat down on people of talent, and brilliance in order to equalize everything. But you find when you're working with the left, and they talk about equality, what they're talking about, there's the tendency to confuse it with sameness. The idea that everyone's the same, that they need the same clothes, they should have the same life, the same things. That's not really equality in the leftist sense. And the best way that I've ever actually heard it articulated, oddly enough, is by Nichiren Daishonin. And that's when he talks about there's essentially three group dynamics that you can possibly have when you have a large group of people. There is many in body, many in mind. That is a disorganized crowd. That's what you would consider chaos. And then you have just a bunch of disparate individuals who happen to be grouped together. There's no reason for them to be there, each going after their own interests for whatever reason. It's a big part of capitalist ideology, too. Then we have one in body, one in mind. And this describes everything that right libertarians fear about Stalinists, but it also describes fascism very, very well. And it's the idea of a hegemonized society where everyone thinks the same, everyone does the same, we all follow the same stuff, just a giant monolith. Both of these two dynamics are actually very toxic to a certain extent. The many in body, many in mind is a rife environment for bullies to thrive. So powerful people love that. You know, you got the Koch brothers funding the Libertarian Party. They love the idea of dividing everyone and breaking them down into these atomistic individuals, because if you do that and you're more powerful than everyone else, it's very, very easy to get your way and nobody can gang up on you because there's no organization. Similarly, dictators love one in body, one in mind, because what you have is a giant monolithic society, and there's a ridiculous amount of power in that. But what that happens to do is it crushes the individual. Then you have Nichiren Daishonin's, which is many in body, one in mind. And what this describes is an incredibly diverse society where people are coming from different backgrounds, different ideas, different skill sets, and they're all working towards one end. And this society, I think, is probably the best group dynamic that you can possibly have, because what happens is that each different person, when they all work together, when they work towards one end, and they all respect each other and see each other as inherently morally equal and deserving of respect, even though they're not the same, as each person succeeds, they help everyone else succeed, and this creates a positive feedback loop. So that very much is like, if you hear a leftist talk about equality and diversity, that's really what they're talking about. Now, they'll use some problematic terms to talk about it. One of the ones that I have a lot of problems with is solidarity. Because solidarity, though it's kind of good, it sort of relies upon you being an in-group and having another out-group out there. There has to be, you're trying to bind together a group based upon some external antagonist, which does work. It will bind together a group. But the problem is, if you don't have an external antagonist, you either find one or you split your group, and you go about witch hunts, essentially. And we saw that happen with the Soviets. And Stalin's paranoia. We see it happen in leftist circles today, every day, when they become obsessed with purity of view, purity of action, and for whatever extent, essentially they become Puritans. So I think that's really what we're talking about when we talk about equality. Do you understand what I'm getting at there?
Yeah. So the one that you identified with, one in mind, many in body.
Many in body, one in mind.
I mean, that's what the Christians say, but I think the definition that I'm using, and I'm gonna see if you agree with this as being accurate. This is from Robert Louis Dabney, The Anti-Biblical Theory of Rights, and he's describing Jacobinism.
Mhm.
One, there can be no just imputation of the consequences of conduct from one human being to another in society. Two, no adult person can be justly debarred from any privilege allowed to any other person in order or society, except for conviction of crime. Three, all distinctions of caste are essentially and inevitably wicked and oppressive. Four, of course, every adult is equally entitled to the franchise of voting and being voted for, and for restrictions here except for the conviction of crime or natural injustice. Equal rights and suffrage ought to be conceded to women in every respect as to men. Those are his 5 points of what, I mean, it's the left, but he calls it Jacobinism. And
Yeah.
I think that we see that's a pretty detailed and largely accurate description of what most historical left-wing policy has been,
Yeah.
philosophy. And
Well, you know what? I will agree with you 100% there, and those sound to me to be very solid bits of policy. I'm sure there are issues with them because the law is a
implementation.
yeah, the law
But
is a
it's,
blunt instrument. You're never going to be able to properly Im- implement policy to everyone. It's not one size fits all. We don't want
yeah.
everyone on a bed of Procrustes,
But
essentially.
what I mean is that that is the kind of society that an egalitarian society would aim to strive for.
Yeah, to one extent or another. And I mean, caste, we have to be very careful when we talk about caste. Like you talk about societies working. Um, and what I would say is, and I meant to get to this earlier, but I think I lost my point halfway through. Hindu society, perfect example of a society that worked and endured for centuries, for thousands of years. And it was all based upon a very specific caste system where when you and to the extent of where, like, if you read the Bhagavad Gita, um, Arjuna is sitting there talking to Krishna, who is essentially an ass. He's God, basically. He's God taken mortal form. Um, and through the conversation that Arjuna has with Krishna, Arjuna himself also becomes enlightened and becomes like God. So it'd be like if you talked to Jesus, and by the end of it, you were divine, just like Jesus was. Um, in this, Arjuna is part of the warrior caste, and there's a war going on, and Arjuna doesn't want to fight in it. And he asks Krishna, like, what do I do here? Because I'm bound by honor to fight for my family, but I don't believe in this war. I don't believe in what's going on. And the answer is something that I think a lot of people in our society would find to be completely unconscionable, which is Krishna responds to him, you might as well go fight because that's what you are. You are you're part of the warrior caste, and it is better for you to be the worst warrior in the universe than to not fulfill your role as a warrior. The idea that, like, someone happens to be born into a merchant class and maybe they don't want to be a merchant, and all of their skill sets point them at being a warrior. The Hindu caste system would say no, you be the worst merchant in the world before you be a warrior, because that's outside of what's been predetermined for you.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and that's why I kind of said we need to use a little bit of empathy, and we need to pull ourselves out of this. We can look at that Hindu caste system, which the Buddha spent so much time overcoming, and say that is obviously wrong and a foolish way to run society. But you know what? It worked for a really, really long time, longer than Western democracy has worked.
Well, exactly. But the
But it was
point that
also massively inherently immoral and abusive and every
yeah,
other thing.
the point that I was getting at was just as the anarchist argues that capitalism has within itself, even this purely platonic form of it that the ANCAPs talk about, has within the seeds of itself the rise of the state. Egalitarianism has the seeds within itself the inevitable lurch to a totalitarianism, because
Yeah.
the only way that an egalitarian society can implement all of the things that Dabney talks about is
Hmm.
by some sort of overwhelming external power that forces people. For instance, this one is very important. There could be no just imputation of the consequences of conduct from one human being to another in society. That's obviously absurd. If somebody is lazy and foolish and ignorant and chooses to waste their lives in frivolity and nothingness, they should not be rewarded or respected or remunerated equally with someone who is an honest, upstanding, hardworking person.
Sure, but also I'm going to point out two things. One, should is a very dangerous word because we have plenty of people who are exactly like that. I've met many of them, and most of them are rich. You have no idea how many trust fund babies are
Oh
running
yeah,
around in the East Village right now who
they're
are,
running around as
yeah.
Antifa right now.
Well, actually, I do know a lot of Antifa, and Antifa do not tend to be wealthy. There are some, but the ones that are actually ready to fight, most of them are homeless. Um, and it's actually interesting that you bring that up because just 2 weeks ago here in New York, two guys were viciously attacked by Nazis in the East Village on Essex Street because they saw an Antifa sticker on one of their phones. The cops did catch one of them, but I mean, these guys, like, it was like 6-on-2, and one of them pulled a knife and literally tried to murder this guy.
Yeah, but the point that you're getting at with the rich person, I'm trying to understand what you're getting at because, yeah, you can be poor and lazy, and you can be rich and lazy, and I don't think that in either case should justice prejudice you one way or the other. The person needs to be, Paul says you don't work, you don't eat.
Yeah.
So
Well,
the idea is,
that's Stalin, though. That's literally a quote of Stalin's you just did.
well, hey, I mean, a broken clock is right twice a day, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the saying goes. But you see, that's the fundamental point. You cannot run a society. In fact, that's the conclusion that Owen's son made after the failure of the New Harmony incident. He
Mhm.
said that people that don't work cannot be treated the same as people that do work. Um,
I think to a certain extent, yes, but also we're getting to a point in human progress where we do have more than enough and we actually can feed people who don't work. Now, we want to talk about people who don't work, who don't want to contribute. There's two aspects to that. One, the person has serious mental illness, massive depression, ridiculously high anxiety, and that's why they don't want to work. They're literally battling demons. Um, the other aspect is this sort of, I guess, straw man. And I'm sure I'm sure there are people out here like this because there are people like everything, um, who is just lazy. But the thing is that, and this actually does come down to a difference between conservative and progressive liberal thought. Conservatives tend to think of people as a single thing, that a person has a certain kind of moral character, and they will be that forever. Whereas a lot of more progressive thought is that people are products of their environment, and that if you can give people change, and when you
wait,
change
this
your
this is a key
environment, they
point here, huh?
change.
Key point: are they solely a product of environment?
No, certainly not.
Okay, because there are some on the left that would say that, which gets
Oh,
to the more
yeah,
ridiculous central
Marx.
planning.
Yeah,
No,
Marxists.
no conservative would deny what the tension is not between are you are innately because who you are as a constituted as a human being versus the external conditions around you. So, for example, the Christian doctrine of sin says that we all have an inclination and a bent towards the evil.
Hmm.
Now, does that mean that now the condition? So, for instance, let's say your father was abusive, then
Yeah.
you abuse your son, so then he's abusive. Now we can all rationalize that and say, well, look, there's this cycle of dysfunctionality that's through the experiences of these individuals. But then we also have examples of individuals who were in the very same cycle, but through some either external or internal event, did not repeat that. So they
Yeah,
did not
but
repeat that
is it
pathology.
really the very same cycle? Or is it just similar enough to that cycle that we conclude it's the same? I got into this with a number of libertarians because they were trying to prove natural laws to me, which is ridiculous, by the way. And one of the arguments they put forth was, well, is a circle objectively a circle? And I had to say, no, it's not, because a circle does not exist in nature. A circle exists in the human mind. Whereas when we look at something in nature that we all decide is a circle, It feels objective, but if you get really close and you look at that circle, there is something about it that is not perfect, that is not exactly a circle or a triangle or a square. So really what we get to is we get to a point where something is just similar enough that our brains kind of write it off and go, okay, yeah, that's the same thing. It objectively is a circle, but no, it's really not. It subjectively is a circle. It just happens to be very circle-ish.
Okay, this gets back to a point that I brought up earlier, and I'm glad you went in this direction. So, are you familiar with the problem of universals? I brought up nominalism before.
Making a universal statement.
Well, the problem of universals, it's related to that, but it's a little more complicated. The
Mhm.
problem of universals is the idea, do universals, so Plato defined the universals as these abstract essences. So, for instance, when I look at, say, a Greek, an Egyptian, a Persian, I all know that they are men. They may not be the same kind of men that I am, but they're all men, and I intuitively know this. If I look at a Great Dane, a poodle, or a collie, I know they're all dogs. And he
Right.
argues that their universals are these universal concepts that physical objects participate in insofar as they are that thing.
Oh, I
So,
get this. Okay, I'm
so,
sorry.
so,
Keep
so,
keep
so,
going.
so now the universals, there's pretty much three, maybe four main views. There's realism, which says that universals are mind independent. They do not exist. They exist in the mind, but they exist independently of the mind in the realm of the forms.
Hmm.
Those are the Platonic forms. Now, Aristotle argued that they are mind independent, but they don't exist in universals in this sort of abstract aether. They exist in material objects.
Yeah.
So the form of, you cannot have matter without form.
Hmm.
Okay. Now nominalism comes along and says that the only thing that they only exist in the mind.
Hmm.
The universals exist nowhere outside of the mind.
Hmm.
Now, here's the thing. What you said sounded very much like nominalism. Universals exist
Yeah.
only in the mind.
Only in the mind, except that in and of itself is a universal statement. So I should be
But
careful with that.
but that's the point. Nominalism is by definition absurd. It's absurd because it violates its own principles.
Yeah, but also I think anything violates its own principles because nothing is perfect. And I kind of wanted to get with this. You were talking about how the argument is that, oh God, I'm going to help the ANCAPs here a little bit. Um, the argument is that the stateless society has within itself the seeds, the DNA for the creation of the state, be it a free market society or be it a left anarchist society. But the thing is that because nothing is perfect, absolutely nothing is perfect, um, everything contains its negation. Everything is not completely 100% together.
Wait, by everything, hold on a second. I want to be specific here. By everything, you mean material reality, right?
Every material reality, and also honestly every idea that you can think of. If you want to consider, you can consider ideas a part of material reality, but Buddhists talk about, for instance, the 10 worlds.
Well,
um,
I think in your context, it's not actually material reality; it's immaterial reality.
yeah, I mean, all, if you want to call it material or immaterial,
Because
the concept of
it's
the
a
10
division.
worlds.
It's the division between monism and dualism.
um I know what you're talking about, and some people do believe that. But like some people believe the 10 worlds are 10 literal worlds, and you go to the hell realm, and the hell realm is this, and the inhabitants of it act like, this, like, I don't know, devils and pitchforks and fire. Then you go to the realm of hungry ghosts, and there's a bunch of ghosts that are all emaciated and, have tiny stomachs and are trying as hard as they can to eat as much, but the food keeps falling out. Or the world of animals, and it's just like a really bestial society. But the thing about the 10 worlds, at least in modern Buddhists thought, is that it is a metaphor for the basic 10 states of mind that a human can find themselves in. And it's called a world because essentially what each individual human is, and I hinted on this earlier, is we're a self-contained universe. Our perceptions are unique. and we're all reacting to the same reality, but it's never going to be the same from person to person to person. So each world contains each and every one of the worlds contains the other 10 within it. Within hell, there is the heaven realm, and there's the realm of hungry ghosts, and there's the realm of animals, and there's the realm of the Buddha and the Bodhisattva. And so one of the things that Tentai, who is a very influential Buddhist thinker, and then after him Nichiren realized, came down to a concept called Ichinen Sanzen. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but it's the idea that I've probably said that wrong, um, but it is um, the idea of 10,000 worlds in an instant of life, and how each and every world contains everything else within it. And so what matters when you're at that is, what are you going to focus on?
Yeah. I want to clarify something real quick.
Yeah.
I misdefined nominalism. Conceptualism is the idea that that universals only exist in the mind. Nominalism is the position that there is no actual reality to universals. They're just labels we slap on objects for convenience. So would you take the stronger nominalist claim, or the more limited conceptualist claim?
Could you repeat it? Because I figured I was Googling. I have it's called Ichinen Sanzen. It's the 3,000 realms in a single moment of life. Okay, that
Yeah,
was what I was referring to.
but conceptualism says that universals exist pretty much only in the mind, and the mind would be human mind. Now, these is a Catholic school of thought, so presumably also the mind of God. And then there's nominalism, which says that universals don't really exist at all. They're just convenient labels we give to objects to get by.
I would be. I would probably to be careful, I would cleave to the second idea a little bit more than the first.
So nominalism, you would say that they actually don't exist. They're just convenient labels we give to things to figure out how to just get by in the moment.
Yeah, to understand the world around us. Now, I mean, but once again, nothing
But
is perfect. So I'm
but
sure
here's
there's
the
an
point.
exception to that.
But here's the point: if nominalism is just a series of labels on things that have no real meaning, then nominalism itself is a meaningless label.
Yeah. Well,
No, I mean, but you
that's
see,
the doctrine of emptiness.
that can't be true by definition. Whereas realism,
Why can't it be true by definition?
because it's a logical contradiction, it violates its own principle.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas let's say realism. Realism says that I'm not I'm a partial realist, but the realist says, like Plato, that universals exist independently outside of the mind and also in the mind. Now, no contradiction has arisen there. That is a statement that has a truth value that can be adjudicated by some other method. A statement that contradicts itself by definition has no truth value and doesn't even get to the table of discussion.
Yeah, but here's the problem, and it's the way you're thinking about it. Things can be true and untrue at the same time, and they can contradict themselves without actually contradicting themselves. If that makes sense.
Well, can you give an example?
Yeah. Okay. So a great example of this, I use this a lot when I talk about it, is when people talk about collectivism versus individualism. And they talk about it as a dichotomy. But really, when you look at collectivism and individualism, and when you think about what a human really is, this isn't two trains that are destined to crash into one another. What they really are is two trains running on two different tracks in opposite directions. Every human being is an individual, and every human being is also part of a collective, because what is the collective but just the idea of the aggregate of individuals? So the idea of person versus society is actually a false dichotomy. So what can happen is that, like that with individuals, it's easy to make this mistake where you begin to think that an idea is self-contradictory because of the limitations in our language and in what we can conceive in our minds. But what I find a lot of the time is that when we find these contradictions, they're not actually contradictions. They just appear to be because they come so close to a contradiction.
Okay. That's the distinction that's very interesting, but I want to press on this because there are things that are apparent contradictions. It's based on the analogous use of language. We get confused sometimes, and we think there's a contradiction when there isn't,
Mhm.
and we call those things paradoxes.
Yeah.
They're not. But the thing is, if I were to say that at Brenton Lengel at time t is both Brenton Lengel and not Brenton Lengel, then that is ludicrous. That doesn't mean anything at all. I haven't said anything that means anything.
It's funny actually because Buddhist theories on time would agree with you.
That you are both are and are not.
I am and am not. I am Brenton Lengel in the sense that, hey, I am this being of like flesh and teeth and brain that happens to exist within this continuum right now. But I am also a being that is that idea, Brenton Lengel, is that's the self. And the self is ultimately illusory, not because it doesn't exist, but because it will end. Yeah, I'm Brenton Lengel from the atoms in my body are in this particular arrangement for this time, and then when we get to the point of my death, bam, the atoms split out and they go into something else. And so what am I? Am I Brenton Lengel right now? Yes. But am I something bigger and something more? Absolutely. Because all of the pieces of me will be something else. And ultimately they're part of
Something
everything
else.
in the
Well,
entire
let me give you an
universe.
example. This reminds me of the this reminds me of the atheist philosophy of being called mereological nihilism.
Mhm.
Nihilism, of course, means the idea that there's no like in the ethical sense where the word comes from. It means there's no absolute truth.
Mhm.
And then nihilism, but it also could be seen as similar to nominalism. There's no objective forms out there, and
Yeah.
the mereology has to do with the study of shapes and forms of things. So a human being, according to a materialist outlook, is not a it's not you. It's just a collection of atoms shaped you wise. And then when you die, those atoms get scattered throughout the universe, and some are consumed by animals, some rot into the dust, others, they just become one with
Yeah.
the universe again. And so Buddhism sounds like that sounds a lot like Buddhism what I just said, doesn't it? But
It
it's from an
does, but it's a limited view of Buddhism. It is a
yeah, it's
view of it's a view. So Buddhism has some aspects in common with nihilism, but it's like nihilism only got half the story. And it's because the nihilists are still attached to the body. They're still attached to the self. They're still clinging to that idea. And then they run into what's called Jara Marana, which is essentially fear of death, death
yeah,
crying.
yeah.
So what happens is that they see
Freudian Thanos.
yeah, Thanos, exactly. They see, which is funny because Thanos in the Greek sense is actually peaceful death. Kira's, his sister, is violent or unfortunate death. Um, just a fun quirk of language that I learned. But
Huh.
they look at this thing and what they say is they see this tiny, tiny part of existence that their consciousness happens to occupy, and they see that their consciousness will end and that it will that they'll be broken up and their consciousness will be annihilated. And that's true. That is true. That will happen. But what happens after that? What we what does that mean that our true nature is?
For nihilism, nothing. You're one
Yeah,
thing.
exactly. Nihilism says nothing, but Buddhism actually says everything. We are the flux. That is the Buddha
Well,
in,
really, it
in a
just
lot of
looks
ways.
like that you're looking at the same thing from two different points of view.
Exactly.
But then again, that's just the same Buddhist contradictory outlook,
Well,
synthesized with.
again, it's not contradictory. It can appear contradictory, but once again, a lot of what Buddhist philosophy is about and what Buddhist meditation goes back to is to meditate directly on these contradictions, these things that cause cognitive dissonance, And through our meditation on them, we actually wind up defeating the cognitive dissonance, and we realize a greater truth. Once you've broken through that, it's hard. It's very difficult to do that.
I will just say this, Brent. That's why the Western Christendom had a scientific revolution and East Asia didn't.
But they did. They absolutely did. I mean, we like to be very chauvinistic about our own accomplishments, but I mean, look at East Asia. Look at the creation of gunpowder. Like,
Do
yeah,
you mean now? I mean, yeah, East Asia is the first.
no,
China.
even then. I mean, there's certain times that one culture or another culture will jump ahead of the other. I argued with a Nazi the other day.
About my whiteness, my white
Yeah,
superiority.
it's white superiority, and he so I brought up
China.
I brought up China, I brought up the great Islamic empires, all of these massive civilizations that made huge strides forward. Because what he took issue with was, he said, give me one thing that's good about diversity, and I said, it's so we can solve different problems. You idiot. The you idiot was implied.
Yeah, it's implied,
Yeah,
but
never know where the solution is going to come from, so it's important to have different people with different points of view.
well, let me put it more
Mhm.
abstractly and maybe less chauvinistically. The West had a great divergence; nobody else did.
Yeah, at the moment, yes, but I guarantee you our culture is going, it probably already has started to I guess what's the word, coagulate.
Well, but if you look at let's look at from what we know of already written history and what we can glean from prehistory of human societies. There never was a great divergence. There was just a kind of convergence on a kind of mean of human existence.
Hmm.
There was a kind of mean of human existence that existed from Mesoamerica to Mesopotamia, from the Roman Empire to Chinese Empire.
Hmm.
But the idea of a great divergence, where one society just becomes, there's that statement of
One society takes over the world, essentially, is what you
well,
could
yeah,
talk
pretty
about it.
much. I mean, it's kind of like when Cassius says in Julius Caesar, he doth bestride the world like a colossus, and we meager men stand between his legs. I mean,
Yeah.
that's never happened.
So we stood between this. You know what? It's really funny because every time I hear that line, I always imagine looking up Caesar's skirt because
Yeah.
they wore which may have
I
been implicit in
implied.
that line.
Well,
Yeah,
I don't
he's got
necessarily
a
mean
big
that
old dick.
in the obvious sense.
Yeah.
It's military conquest, but what I'm really getting at is the ideological conquest. These Western ideas
Hmm.
have been exported everywhere, and then the indigenous peoples, when they tried to fight the Europeans, the only way they could do it was by appropriating the Western ideas themselves.
Well, I mean, a lot of Western ideas are good ideas. A lot of them are also bad ideas. Just because an idea leads us to be able to conquer.
Well, I
Um,
mean, flourish. I mean, conquering, I know is a side
well,
problem of that, but the flourishing of Western art and literature during the Great Divergence.
yeah, but
I mean, look at
you have that flourishing specifically because of the conquest. You know, it's like
no,
you're living on a credit
that
card.
happens before the conquest. In 1500, anybody looking at Western Europe would say it's a primitive backwater of
Hmm.
lice-ridden peasants.
Yep.
If an alien came down in 1500, they would bet on China, they would bet on the Aztecs, they would bet on Mesoamerica,
Yeah.
the Islamic Caliphate.
They're forgetting something though if they bet on that. Um, what they're forgetting, I agree with you, but what they're forgetting is that it is through struggle with obstacles that we better ourselves.
Yes.
You only become better when you are faced with adversity, and the worse the adversity, when you finally overcome it, the better you are. As a result, we're going to look at, lice ridden people living in close proximity with their animals. It's disgusting. It's a small amount of property. The old Monty Python joke where it says, I must be a king, and I won't say the rest of that joke. um, but here's the thing: when we came over to the New World, we were gross compared to the Native Americans, who were, by all accounts,
Cleaner.
like cleaner, beautiful. They smelled better. There was a big problem with people running off to join them. But they were destroyed. They were absolutely decimated by disease. It was actually way worse than being decimated. Like 90% of them
Yeah,
died
it was disease.
as the result of a plague, whereas we were insulated against disease because we had dealt with the Black Plague, because we had dealt with these awful conditions. So here's the thing, though. As our society progresses and as we get on top, we run into less obstacles. When we run into fewer obstacles, we cease to progress, and the more oppressed societies begin to progress past us.
Okay,
Um,
hold on a second. I agree with that in principle, but
mhm,
the fact is that doesn't explain the Great Divergence. Warring States China, Warring States Japan had the same system, but they then returned back to stasis.
mhm.
Europe didn't return back to stasis. Europe continued, and furthermore, it's not
For
just
now.
struggle, but it's not just
Yeah.
struggle. It's also a set of ideas.
Mhm.
For instance, the idea of the uniformity of nature is a derivative of the Judeo-Christian outlook, which is in large part why outside of Western Christendom you didn't develop any sort of scientific progress in the sense that we would understand it today,
Mhm.
because you needed an idea that doesn't exist elsewhere, and that's a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. The
Mhm.
idea of personhood, beginning with in germinal form with Plato, then further developed by Augustine, who writes the first autobiography, and then it's further refined and developed within the Western tradition. But this idea of personhood um, gives us a new way of looking at the world that allows us for new opportunities that other societies didn't have, and in part allowed us to break through that cycle of going to the mean.
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not going to disagree with that. But what I'm going to say is that you're overstating the importance of a specific point in history. I'm sure if you jumped back to the golden age of China or the Islamic empires, they would say the exact same thing about any other particular innovation that they had in thought. And you know, we're caught in a certain paradigm right now, possibly at the very end of the Western paradigm.
I think you're probably
Um,
right. They probably would say that.
yeah, and so I think that what's important to remember is the Roman Empire. I actually talked with I was talking with Rogue, the lead singer of the Cruise Shadows, about this. The guy that you kind of remind me of, or you remind me of him. Uh, and what he said to me was, he said, you know, what was really interesting about Rome was that at one point they had plans to create a steam engine, and in fact they were so incredibly close to having essentially the industrial revolution, but it didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? It didn't happen because they had slaves, because they had you know, you didn't invent a fan when you had human beings to come and fan you. um, each society as it, and Bakunin talked about this. He said it is the characteristic of privilege to kill the minds of men, and to destroy geniuses. Once you get to a lofty place, you obviously don't want it to change too much, and it's difficult to keep driving. So what we've seen is we've seen this huge rise of Western civilization, and that's great. And a lot of our ideas were really, really good and still are. And I definitely think there's a lot that is valuable about what we have done. Um, but if we are at what I think at the beginning of a period of decline, that's going to mean that new ideas are going to take our place. And
Well,
honestly, that's possibly for the best, because that's how human progress works.
yeah, but the slave argument again, I think in part does account for it. But Western Europe was a slave serf society as well, and yet still, if you look at Europe, if you look at the whole world in 1500, everybody has involuntary servitude of some kind.
Yeah, but serfs were significantly different from slaves.
Of course.
I mean, especially when you consider like American style chattel slavery, which was more monstrous than anything Rome ever did. But the serfs were actually self sufficient. And in fact, there's, if you go into left anarchist circles, there's a lot of writing about what the state did to force the serfs into a worse position than they had been in previously, where they had to go and take up jobs working in factories as opposed to being self-sufficient peasants farming off the land and, giving however much of their crop to the Lord. It was actually worse for them in a lot of ways that they got into the early days of industrial capitalism.
Yeah. Okay. There's so many things we could go down into that that
Yeah.
could be a whole podcast by itself. But a couple points I want to make before we begin to wrap it up, and then we can.
It's a good idea. We've been at this almost 2 hours.
Almost 2 hours. So there's 2 points that I want to make. One point is that, and this again, if could lead to a lot of rabbit trails, so we might want to stay on task on this one.
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
that the left, generally speaking, has sought to challenge private power. I remember Chomsky talked about Humboldt writing about the limitations of state power, because at his day, that was the only thing he had to really worry about. Private power wasn't really a problem yet. But when it developed as a problem in places like, Germany and northern Italy with the de Medicis and all those banking families, and then also in places like Holland and England, where you culminate with the City of London and the Bank of England, he said that, well, we need to strive to stop state power. But you see, that is not the only goal, but a very central goal of the left. And yet, if you look at the past 300 years, it's been a complete failure. Private power is more overwhelming, more powerful than ever before.
Yeah, though I wouldn't. Here's the deal: just because you're winning doesn't mean you're right.
No, I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying that the left has failed in one of its fundamental objects, whereas the right has been able, not recently, but we have been able to defeat private power from ancient Israel to the Renaissance. At least within Jewish Christian societies, usury was outlawed, and the outlawing of usury and the enforcing sanctions, both social and political, prevented the growth and development of private power. Now, for some reason, we have a system that can actually control private power. It's just not being implemented at the moment.
Yeah.
The left has no system to restrain private power.
Well, they do. It's just monstrous. If we're talking about
Stalinism.
Stalinism, and anarchism is effective at restraining private power, but it's not necessarily effective at defending itself.
Well, what I mean is not just defending yourself, rolling back private power and putting it, destroying it. Because that seems to be the objective of the far left, is to just not only roll it back, but
the revolution and expropriation. It would be the left's tactics there. And to be fair, look at the French Revolution. I mean, that was a major win. I mean, there were some awful things that happened, but if we're talking left v right,
from the left's perspective, but it wasn't a major win in the sense of private power. The left's major.
The threat there wasn't private power; it was
state power.
Yeah,
but it got worse.
Yeah, though you could argue that a monarchic state is a private state. I mean, one of the worst tragedies in all of history. I think it was actually on par, if not worse, than the Holocaust. A lot of people don't know about, and it is the Congo Free State, when King Leopold II took control of the Congo, ostensibly to help the Congo, but wound up, one of the worst genocides known to man.
Whether it's private power or public, however we want to parse a monarchical state, Louis XIV was not as tyrannical as the Reign of Terror or later Napoleon. There was a complete setback if you wanted to roll back private power. So public power, state power. But the other thing is state power is also, especially in the 20th century, reaches apogee of horrifying power. And in the left, I mean, Anna Arendt, who's a leftist, says that the perfection of totalitarianism is in the Soviet Union.
Oh, yeah.
And so the left failed on both counts, private and public power. It has no answer to either one.
Well, I mean, first off, there is, and it was interesting because we were in here and you quoted Stalin. There are a lot of leftists that consider Stalinism a right-wing deviation.
No, Stalin was quoting Paul. To be fair, Stalin was quoting. Go ahead, sorry.
Paul. You mean the Apostle Paul?
He was quoting the Apostle Paul.
Man, that is, you know what though? That is a jerk thing for Paul to say when Jesus did the fish and the loaves thing. that
Well, let's
actually
argue
is
theology later.
massively-
Let's
yeah.
have this for
Okay.
another podcast.
Yeah, that
Theology
would
could
a
be a
great
whole
one.
another 3-hour debate. So let's just go.
Yeah. I'll tell you what. Let me. There was a thing here that I wanted to read, and I think this is somewhat on topic with, if not directly right now, but it's on topic with the entire argument that we've been having. And this is by Emma Goldman. It says, "But what about human nature? Can it be changed? And if not, will it endure under anarchism? Poor human nature, what horrible crimes have been committed in thy name. Every fool, from king to policeman, from flat-headed parson to visionless dabbler in science, presumes to speak authoritatively of human nature. The greater the mental charlatan, the more definite his insistence on the wickedness and weakness of human nature. Yet how can anyone speak of it today, with every soul in a prison and every heart fettered, wounded, and maimed? John Burroughs has stated that experimental study of animals in captivity is absolutely useless. Their character, their habits, their appetites undergo a complete transformation when torn from their soil in field and forest. When, with human nature caged into a narrow space and whipped daily into submission, how can we speak of its potentialities? Freedom, expansion, opportunity, and above all, peace and repose. These alone can teach us the real dominant factors of human nature and all of its wonderful possibilities. Anarchism, then, really stands for the liberation of the human mind from the domination of religion, the liberation of the human body from the domination of property, the liberation from the shackles and restraint of government. Anarchism stands for a social order based on the free grouping of individuals for the purpose of producing real social wealth, an order that will guarantee every human being free access to the earth and full enjoyment of the necessities of life according to individual desires, tastes, and inclinations. This is not a wild fancy or an aberration of the mind. It is the conclusion arrived at by hosts of intellectual men and women the world over, a conclusion resulting from the close and studious observation of the tendencies of modern society. Individual liberty and economic equality, the twin forces for the birth of what is fine and true in man."
I will just say non Saravam. I mean, that's what it is. But no, the point is this: the left says that these external forces are holding men back from their true potential. The traditionalist says no, man's true potential can only be attained via the maintenance of these structures that structure our desires and our inclinations and train us.
Mhm.
Now, show me the anarchist Aquinas and Shakespeare and Dante, and I'll begin to take it seriously. But you can't do that.
You might be talking to him.
Well, we'll see.
That's egotistical. We'll see. We'll see how history.
No,
judges.
I would actually agree that communism is not incompatible with genius, because almost all the great medieval thinkers lived in monasteries.
Yeah.
So since they were communists, but here's the difference: their communism was not based on "I will not serve." In fact, one of their oaths was the oath of obedience
And servitude. Correct.
and servitude, obedience, chastity, and poverty.
Mhm.
Now, the fact is, if anarchists really want to live in a propertyless society, to join a monastery or join a Hutterite commune. But I doubt they really want to have a propertyless society.
Well, no, hang on, because I've been confronted with that before. That's not a fair argument. And the reason why it's not fair is anarchists aren't just concerned about themselves. If they were, they wouldn't be anarchists. Yes, I could run off and join a commune somewhere, or just run off into the mountains and be a hermit somewhere and be perfectly free exactly the way that I want to be, at least until I get sick. But that's not the point. The point is I'm not interested in living in a different society. I'm interested in changing this one. Both for myself and for everyone else around me. And the demand that a social critic remove himself from society that's a very, very cheap way of attacking.
Okay, hold on. I want to clarify this. There's a misconception here. I don't mean that the social critic should go like Henry David Thoreau and just no. I don't mean that. I mean, you said that you want to make society in such a way that you can live this way. And what I'm saying is the only society in which you can live that way is a traditionalist one. Because the only examples we have
Uh-huh.
of proper. The only examples you have of properly societies that actually don't just work but flourish are
Mhm.
those that are of a religious disposition. Buddhist monasteries, Catholic and Orthodox monasteries, peasant, the
Yeah.
Anabaptist communes.
Absolutely. Well, I would actually argue, because there was a bit in the Emma Goldman essay that I realized was wrong.
Clericalism, the
As I,
anti-clericalism.
well, not just that. I do agree that I think that church power does need to be checked and dismantled to a certain extent, but I don't think humans can live without religion. I don't think it's a good idea, because we get eaten up by anxieties once we come to the idea that everything is essentially chaos and that the universe doesn't care about you. And the fact is, the universe does care about you, because you are the universe, at any given point in time. Um, and also, the other thing I disagree with Emma Goldman on there is when she talks. I think she overly talks about the free enjoyment of everything on the earth, included according to individual desires, tastes, and inclinations. And I'll tell you why that's true. She's wrong, because like what she's picturing is really great, but it's not reality, because you can't really say that someone is free if they encounter no resistance. You can't really claim to be alive if you don't die. And without that negation, without that struggle, there's no reason to be there.
Hold on. There's a lot of theology I like to argue, but we can't go there right now. That'd be a whole other podcast. So, but the other, this is the last point that I want to make, and we can wrap it up as we
Absolutely.
tease this out. The two prongs that the left wanted to achieve, beginning with the Enlightenment,
Hmm.
as I see it, are twofold. One, the dismantling of centralized power, both state power and private power, and then
Hmm.
also the corollary is the social attitudes. The social attitudes primarily being expressed in the destruction of traditional morality at the time, which was Christian morality.
Hmm.
And again, we see that again even today, and not just amongst anarchists, but also libertarians and fascists. I mean,
Hmm.
all of them wanted to tear down Christian morality. When Hitler said he wants a generation of men as hard as steel and heartless, well, that's the opposite of what we get on the Sermon on the Mount. That's a complete opposite ethic. So
Absolutely.
all of these groups wanted to dismantle in part or in whole Christian ethics, which was the ethics that they grew up with.
Hmm.
Now, here's the problem. The failure of the left to defeat private power is directly correlated to their embracing of these values, of these social values. Because as we see in something like Brave New World with Aldous Huxley, it's a totalitarian state run by technocrats, but what is everybody doing? Everybody's consuming and satisfying their desires. In fact, the sexual revolution itself, in part, was the product of the Rockefeller think tank where they funded Alfred Kinsey in
Yeah.
Bloomington, Indiana. And so the left then said free love. I mean, that goes back, to Lucifer the Light Bearer, that newspaper in the 19th century America.
Hmm.
But free love
I thought you meant
itself,
literally Lucifer the light bearer, but
yeah, exactly. But the point is that for every, now again, correlation does not mean causation, but for every corollary increase or decrease in Christian traditional morality and increase in this, shall we say, Luciferian morality, private power has grown apace.
hmm.
Private power, the only historical example of restraining private power has occurred when one rejects the Luciferian ethic and
Hmm.
then controls. So the modern left, in embracing this Luciferian ethic, like Nietzsche points this out in partially in Twilight of the Idols when he says, if you give up God, the God of the Bible, then you give up Christian morality, because the Bible assumes the Christians assume via the Bible that man does not know what is good for him, and these Christian values themselves are not self-evident at all. And you can point to the different historical views of treating people, the poor and the weak, or the sick or the elderly, and we don't want to get into all that at the moment. But by getting rid of all those um, inhibitions, both at the at all levels of life, without you open yourself up to hedonism. There is no non-hedonistic Luciferian ideology, at least not in the long run. In the short run, you might have residual legacy of your previous Buddhist, Christian, Muslim upbringing. But at the end of the day, if you keep in that way of life long enough, you end up with, you basically end up with Slaanesh, the chaos god of Warhammer 40K.
Oh, okay. It's funny because the alt-right is making a bunch of Warhammer 40K references to Donald Trump, who probably is someone who, at least in my mind, I can't think of anyone more hedonist. So this is what I'm going to say in response to that. And I thought of a number of things, so I hope I remember them all, but I probably won't. The first thing that I'm going to say is what's very interesting, because you talk about the failure of the left and how the left has always failed. But if you think about it in a more universal sense, the left actually always wins 100% of the time. And when you look at the arc of history, we used to have kings. We used to own other human beings. We used to have a caste system. And gradually, the past is always destroyed by the future. No matter what you do, no matter how you cling to the past or the institutions or tradition, it will be destroyed one day, and it will be replaced with something else. However, in the same sense, the right also always wins, because the problem with the future, as Hobbes put it, not Thomas Hobbes, but Hobbes the tiger, is that it keeps turning into the present and then keeps turning into the past. So the right perpetually is always in struggle with the left. And these sort of twin forces of humanity are constantly, I guess, at war with each other. But here's the really interesting thing, and this is why I talked about competing drives in the human brain and in human society. One of the things that Daisaku Ikeda did with Soka Gakkai when he started to try to expand the organization to Kyoto is he took two people, one who was an extreme traditionalist, and then he took another younger guy who was the traditionalists thought of as extremely rash with all of these new ideas, and he put them together, and he gave the task of doing this shakabuku, of expanding the organization into Kyoto, to both of them. And what happened was it was a massive success. And the reason why is because politicians gain power by making us fight each other. And the news gains ratings by making us yell at each other and, score these ridiculous wins. But I think, honestly, in the end, the idea is to transcend the right and the left, because just like in individualism and collectivism, these aren't two trains that are destined to crash into one another. These are complementary forces that apply pressure to one another so that you can guarantee the best possible outcome for society. And I think the American people have forgotten that, and I think the people of Earth have forgotten that. And I think if we can, as a species, remember that we're on the same side, and that if we work together, we're going to get something better than either one of us could possibly get on our own. I think that's when you get utopia, and not a fake utopia that can't exist, but an actual utopia in the sense of a society that has a maximized amount of freedom and repose at a given time. So my answer here to the left v right is I like the idea of acknowledging them both as valuable, and
you view it as you view it as a perpetual yin yang.
Exactly, a
Well,
perpetual yin yang struggle that is going somewhere.
Well, okay, that's fine. I mean, the definitions, I guess, are subjective to some degree. But when I speak of the left, and I think when most people speak of the left, we are speaking something along the lines of what Evola meant. Anything that is opposed to the beliefs prior to the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Which is brand new as a there have been.
Overall in humanity.
I mean, there have been proto-leftists. You've got the medieval peasants' revolt in the 16th century. You had Mazdak, the Zoroastrian heretic. But generally speaking, those things they're proto-leftists. They never get very far. I mean, in fact, Marxist historiography often treat them as proto-leftists. But as the left, the way that I'm defining, and I think most people colloquially use it.
Colloquially.
Yeah, that way they use it that way, and in that sense, the left has lost, and frankly, it will end up losing because as the left has been famous of bragging about with declining birth rates in the West, demographics is destiny. Yeah, you're not the ones having kids. I mean, well, you are, but the left in general isn't. So there'll be a day when we wake up, and the leftists will be just a tiny minority because they didn't have any kids, and the people that don't believe it did.
Yeah, but not everyone keeps the values of their parents, and that's part of being the left, and part of that is rejecting it. I mean, you've got the quiverful movement sitting there thinking they can go and outbreed everyone and enforce this vision of society, but what they don't realize is that they're putting into earth individuals with their own individual minds and inclinations, and children tend to be very conservative and adopt the attitudes of their parents at first, but we naturally rebel.
Well, we do, but well, look at the arc of history. It's only until the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries that the children fundamentally reject their parents' culture. That's a brand new thing.
Oh, that's not a brand new thing. You can go back and you can find. I forget exactly where it is, but there is. I will find this for you the next time we talk. But there is a rant from ancient Greece about how the kids are not all right.
Oh no, well, yeah, no. I know there's always this generation is worse than the one before, but what I mean is, okay, there are certain paradigm shifts, like from paganism to Christianity, or from traditional Arab polytheism to Islam. But what I mean is the idea of constant flux, where children are constantly rebelling against the ideology of their parents, is a relatively new phenomena.
Well, I mean, they're not constantly, but they will. I mean, and that's, it's kind of funny because it's almost like God designed gay people to mess with Republicans because the more children you have, the more likely one of those kids is going to be gay. That's like a fact.
But also, if you are gay, the more likely is your ideology is going to die out.
Well, what ideology? Gay people don't have ideologies. Oh, you mean because they're not breeding? But yeah, the point is that, I gotta say, I really reject the idea that you have a child so you can teach him to be just like you. I'll joke about it whenever I talk with like friends or family, and I talk about wanting to have a kid. I'll go, oh yeah. You know, you can teach them to hate the things you hate, and with the internet, they practically raise themselves. But you know, that's not really how people work. And so I really don't believe in the idea that someone can be outbred. And I don't think.
Oh no, it's historically happened already.
You can say it's happened, but at the same time, look at the dominant ideologies on the world. I really think rebellion is a natural part of human nature, and I think that you know, as these quiverful people think that they can pop a bunch of people into the world and indoctrinate them, they're going to find that that is a much more difficult task than they first imagined. And it's fine.
I'm not saying it won't be easy, but no, I mean, there's people that
I don't think it's possible.
Well, of course it's possible. Read evolutionary biology, leading evolutionary. I read this one article. The blog is now taken down, unfortunately, and the actual article is behind a paywall, so I can't read it easily anymore. But he basically said that atheism is going to die out within the next 100 years, and that being a gay atheist Jew, he's kind of screwed.
You know, yeah, but again, I don't think atheism is going to die out because atheism has always been.
It'll die out as there's always been a minority of atheists. What I mean is the dominant culture we live in. But let me just end it on this note. If you leftists hadn't tried to genocide us in France and Russia in the 19th century, we could have defeated private power. But you took the side of private power to smash us, and then private power later turned on you.
Okay, and I'm going to say the same thing. If you during the Spanish Inquisition had not tried to genocide us and torture us into compliance.
Well, you didn't exist then. Those are unfortunately mostly Jews.
Well, Jews and Huguenots.
Muslims.
and Muslims.
Well, actually, wait. I'm not Catholic, so that's not me.
Yeah, it's not. We're all everyone. But the point is that there will always be a
Well, wait a minute. The fact that the Inquisition killed you guys didn't lead to the rise of private power. The Catholic Church kept private power under wraps for 1,000 years.
Yeah, and then it failed.
Well, yeah, but it
I
failed
think
after 1,000.
yeah, anytime you violate the Lotus Sutra, you generate bad karma, and anytime you generate bad karma, eventually it's going to come back to you. And
Yeah.
we would talk about the anti-clericalism of the early 19th and 20th centuries. I honestly think the answer to all of this antagonism is, once again, to acknowledge the fellow humanity of the people around us and the equal right to peace, repose, the fruits of the earth, and respect. And when we do that, when we build a humanistic society based upon those values, that's when you're going to see the best in religion come out.
Well, all right. I think we'll just have to leave it there. It's been over 2 hours, so thanks for coming on, Brett.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a blast. If anybody is interested in me and what I'm doing, just Google my name, Brenton Lengel. There's a lot of cool stuff online about me, and very, very great to talk to all of y'all.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.